Most people who own a smartphone have never heard the word coltan. Fewer still could explain how a black metallic ore dug out of stream beds in the eastern Congo ended up funding one of the deadliest conflicts of the modern era. A war that by some estimates killed more people than any conflict since the Second World War. The standard account of the wars that tore through the Democratic Republic of Congo in the late 1990s and early 2000s describes ethnic tension, a collapsed state, and the spillover of the Rwandan Genocide across a border. All of that is true, but it leaves out the ledger. It leaves out the fact that foreign armies stayed in Congo for years after their stated security objectives had been met, because the mines they occupied had become more valuable than the war itself. It leaves out the companies in Europe and North America that bought the ore without asking where the money went. And it leaves out the moment when a United Nations panel sat down with customs records, flight manifests, and bank transfers and produced a document that named names. The Congo War is usually told as a story about soldiers and militias. This is the version told through the money. What the record shows is that the war in the eastern Congo was, in large part, a resource extraction operation that used the language of security to justify its continuation, and that the true beneficiaries were not only the armed groups on the ground, but a network of foreign officers, trading houses, and processing companies whose names appear, sometimes only once, in a set of reports that most of the buying public never read. If you're enjoying this story so far, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe. Drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from. I love hearing from you. To understand what happened in the Congo, you have to start with what the Congo has always had, which is more mineral wealth concentrated in one territory than almost anywhere else on Earth. Copper, cobalt, gold, diamonds, tin, tungsten, and coltan, the ore from which tantalum is extracted, a metal essential for the capacitors inside every mobile phone, laptop, and games console manufactured since the 1990s. Congo's eastern provinces, North Kivu and South Kivu, sit on some of the richest coltan deposits in the world, alongside substantial tin and tungsten reserves that mining engineers refer to collectively, along with gold, as the three tin group metals plus gold, or the conflict minerals, a designation that would only be formalized decades after the extraction had already begun. For most of the 20th century, that wealth flowed out through colonial and then post-colonial extraction networks that enriched a small elite in Kinshasa and the foreign firms they partnered with, while the region itself remained undeveloped, thinly governed, and structurally disconnected from the capital by geography as much as by neglect. Eastern Congo sits closer, in travel time and in trading logic, to Kigali and Kampala than it does to Kinshasa. That geographic fact would turn out to matter enormously once the state that nominally governed the region collapsed. That fragility became catastrophic in 1994. The genocide in Rwanda sent more than 1 million Hutu refugees across the border into eastern Zaire, as Congo was then called, along with the remnants of the Interahamwe militias and the former Rwandan armed forces responsible for the killing. These refugee camps, ostensibly humanitarian settlements administered with the help of international aid agencies, became something closer to armed cantonments. Genocidal leadership retained its command structure inside the camps, taxed the humanitarian aid flowing in, rearmed with weapons purchased through networks that ran back through Kinshasa and beyond, and began launching cross-border raids into Rwanda itself. Rwanda's new government, led by the Rwandan Patriotic Front under Paul Kagame, watched this development with an urgency that is easy to understand and treated it as an existential threat that the international community, having already failed to stop the genocide itself, showed little appetite to address. In 1996, Rwanda backed an armed coalition led by a veteran Congolese rebel named Laurent Kabila, built around a group calling itself the Alliance of Democratic Forces for the Liberation of Congo, and this coalition swept west across Zaire with startling speed. Ugandan forces joined the campaign, motivated by their own security concerns along Congo's northeastern border and by opportunities the collapsing Mobutu state presented. Within 7 months, the alliance had toppled the 3-decade dictatorship of Mobutu Sese Seko, one of the Cold War's longest surviving and most thoroughly personalized regimes, and installed Kabila as president of a renamed Democratic Republic of Congo in May of 1997. That was the First Congo War, and on paper its stated purpose, dismantling the genocidal camps on Rwanda's border and removing a hostile regime in Kinshasa that had tolerated them, had been substantially achieved by the time Kabila took power. What happened next is the part the standard account tends to compress into a single sentence about renewed instability, when the actual sequence of events is considerably more revealing. Kabila, once installed in Kinshasa, moved quickly to distance himself from the Rwandan and Ugandan patrons who had put him there, a decision driven partly by nationalist political pressure inside Congo and partly by his own calculation that continued dependence on foreign armies was untenable for a sovereign president. In July of 1998, he ordered Rwandan and Ugandan military advisors out of the country. Within weeks, in August of 1998, Rwanda and Uganda responded by backing a new rebellion against the very man they had installed a year earlier. This was the Second Congo War, and it drew in the armies of at least 7 other African nations. Zimbabwe, Angola, Namibia, and Chad intervened on Kabila's side, citing regional defense obligations and their own strategic interests. Rwanda and Uganda backed rebel factions, principally the Congolese Rally for Democracy, against him. It became known, with only mild exaggeration, as Africa's World War, and it would eventually be linked, directly or indirectly, to the deaths of an estimated 5.5 million people, the overwhelming majority from disease and starvation caused by the collapse of the region's already fragile infrastructure rather than combat itself. The declared justification on the Rwandan and Ugandan side remained security, the ongoing threat from remnant Hutu militias operating from Congolese soil, a threat that was not fabricated and had genuine roots in the unresolved aftermath of the genocide. But by 1999, something had visibly changed in the character of the occupation, something that the security justification alone could not account for. Rwandan and Ugandan forces, rather than coordinating against a shared enemy and withdrawing once that enemy was contained, began fighting each other directly. The clearest and most documented instance occurred in the Congolese city of Kisangani, where Rwandan and Ugandan troops clashed on 3 separate occasions between 1999 and 2000, with the third and bloodiest confrontation in June of 2000, involving heavy artillery inside a densely populated city and killing hundreds of civilians. The dispute was not over the location of a militia camp. It was over control of the city's diamond trading networks and the air and river routes that moved minerals out of the eastern interior. 2 armies that had entered Congo as allies, fighting a shared enemy for a shared and defensible security reason, were now shelling each other's positions in a city hundreds of kilometers from either country's border, because the city sat on a lucrative trading corridor rather than because it sat on any meaningful front line against the militias either government claimed to be pursuing. This is the detail that the political framing of the war struggles to explain, and the financial framing explains immediately and without strain. If the war were only about security, Allied armies do not turn their artillery on each other over a trading city. They fight each other over a trading city when the trading city has become the actual objective and the original security rationale has quietly become the cover story rather than the cause. Diplomats and journalists covering the war at the time noticed the shift before the United Nations formalized it in a report. Correspondents based in Kigali and Kampala began filing stories describing convoys of minerals moving east across the border under military escort, alongside official government statements that continued to frame the occupation entirely in the language of counterinsurgency. The disconnect between what the convoys were carrying and what the press briefings claimed the soldiers were doing became, over the course of 1999 and 2000, difficult for even sympathetic outside observers to reconcile, and it was that disconnect, as much as any single incident, that prompted the Security Council to authorize a formal investigative panel rather than accept the security rationale at face value. In 2000, the price of coltan on world markets spiked, with a suddenness that had nothing to do with Congo and everything to do with consumer electronics thousands of kilometers away. Sony was preparing to launch the PlayStation 2, and the surge in global demand for tantalum capacitors, driven by the console launch alongside the broader boom in mobile phone manufacturing that decade, pushed coltan prices to roughly 10 times their normal level within a matter of months, with some trading reports placing the spot price as high as $400 a kilogram at its peak, compared to a price closer to $40 a kilogram only a year earlier. For the armed groups occupying Congo's eastern mining areas, this was not background market noise. It was the single most consequential financial event of the entire war. Overnight, control of a Kivu streambed became more valuable, kilogram for kilogram, than it had ever been in the region's recorded history, and the armies occupying that territory responded accordingly, redirecting personnel, transport, and organizational energy toward securing and moving the ore rather than toward the counterinsurgency operations that had ostensibly brought them across the border in the first place. The United Nations Security Council, alarmed by the way the conflict had metastasized from a stated security operation into what increasingly resembled an organized plunder of a neighboring state's natural resources, commissioned a panel of experts to investigate the illegal exploitation of natural resources and other forms of wealth in the Democratic Republic of Congo. The panel's first report was delivered in April of 2001, and it was blunt in a manner that United Nations documents of that era rarely were. It stated that the exploitation of Congo's natural resources by foreign armies had become systematic and systemic, and it used a specific and deliberately chosen phrase to describe what it had found. A war economy centered on the exploitation of coltan, diamonds, gold, timber, and other resources. One in which the presence of Rwandan and Ugandan forces in Congo had shifted from a security operation into an occupation whose primary function had become resource extraction, sustained and in some respects driven by the revenue that extraction generated for the officers and networks controlling it. The panel's report went considerably further than description. It named individuals. Senior Rwandan and Ugandan military officers were identified as having established personal trading networks, in some cases private companies registered outside their home countries, that moved coltan, gold, and diamonds out of Congo through Kigali and Kampala and onward into international markets. Ugandan army commanders in the northeast were tied to gold smuggling networks the panel estimated at tens of millions of dollars a year, with General Salim Saleh, half-brother of Uganda's president, and General James Kazini, named specifically in connection with mineral trading operations run through the occupied territories. On the Rwandan side, the panel documented a company called Rwanda Metals, which the report linked directly to the structures of the Rwandan Patriotic Army, moving coltan out of occupied Kivu territory at a scale the panel estimated in the tens of millions of dollars over the preceding several years. None of this required the fiction of hidden accounts or coded communications. Much of it moved through ordinary customs declarations, published export statistics, and the corporate registries of the countries doing the exporting, because by the time the panel arrived, the operation had grown confident enough not to bother concealing its own paperwork. The panel's most consequential finding, though, concerned where the ore went after it left Central Africa, because that is the step at which a regional war economy became a global supply chain problem. Rwanda and Uganda are not tantalum-producing countries in any geological sense. Neither has significant coltan deposits of its own, a fact confirmed by every geological survey of the region conducted before or since. Yet in the years the panel investigated, both countries reported substantial coltan exports, in Rwanda's case, exports that at points exceeded what any plausible domestic mining capacity could account for by a wide margin. The ore was Congolese, the export certificate said otherwise, and once that ore was mixed into shipments and refined by the small handful of companies worldwide capable of processing raw coltan into usable tantalum powder, refineries located primarily in Europe, North America, and East Asia, its origin became functionally unrecoverable. A capacitor manufactured in Asia from tantalum refined in Europe carried no chemical or documentary trace of the specific streambed in North Kivu, where a child laborer or a militia conscript had panned it out of the mud with a shovel and a plastic basin. There is a particular financial detail buried in the 2002 report that rarely makes it into popular retellings of this history, and it concerns not the armed groups directly, but the banking infrastructure that allowed their revenue to move internationally at all. The panel traced flows of mineral revenue through accounts held at commercial banks in Kigali and Kampala, and from there onward to accounts in Europe used by trading intermediaries to settle payment with refiners. At no point in this chain did any single bank appear to be operating outside ordinary correspondent banking relationships or violating the sanctions regimes in force at the time, because no comprehensive sanctions regime specific to Congo's mineral trade yet existed when most of the transactions the panel documented took place. The absence of a rule is not the same as the absence of a mechanism, and the mechanism here functioned precisely because the regulatory architecture had not yet caught up with the war economy it was meant to govern. That gap between financial practice and financial regulation is itself part of the record, and it explains why the strongest response the international system ultimately produced was not a criminal prosecution of any bank or refiner, but a disclosure requirement written 8 years later into a piece of American legislation focused, on its face, on an entirely different set of financial institutions. If you're hooked on this story, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. Your support means everything and helps me bring you more emotional stories like this one. The 2001 panel report and the more detailed follow-up report issued in October of 2002 named specific companies operating at the point where Congolese minerals entered the formal international economy, and this is where the ledger stops being a story about African militaries and becomes a story about the global commodity trade itself. Among the companies named was a Belgian firm, TradeMet, and a metals refiner named Metalor, based in Switzerland, which the panel identified as among the entities receiving coltan and gold that had passed through the hands of the armed groups and military networks the report described in detail. A British-registered company, Aframex, was separately named in connection with the tin and coltan trade out of Kivu, and would later become the subject of a formal complaint filed under the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development's Guidelines for Multinational Enterprises. The United Kingdom's National Contact Point, the government body responsible for adjudicating such complaints, upheld the complaint in part in 2008, finding that the company had failed to observe due diligence over its supply chain and that its payments to armed groups controlling mining areas had provided material benefit to those groups' continued operations. None of the companies named in these reports were accused of firing a weapon or issuing an order to a soldier. What the record shows is something structurally different, and in some ways more damning, that an international commodities trade existed which was functionally indifferent to the question of who controlled the mine, so long as the ore arrived at the refinery gate and the payment cleared on schedule. The mechanism that allowed this indifference to function is worth naming precisely, because it is not an accident of the ore trade. It is a design feature of how global commodity supply chains have historically operated, in the Congo and elsewhere. Raw coltan mined in North Kivu passed through a chain of local buyers, regional export houses based in Bukavu, Goma, Kigali, and Kampala, and international trading firms, before it ever reached one of the small number of processing plants capable of refining it into tantalum powder or finished tantalum capacitors. At every step before the refinery gate, the ore's origin was a matter of paperwork rather than physical evidence, and the paperwork was produced by the same networks the panel had already identified as controlled by, or paying tribute to, the armed groups and military officers named in its reports. Once refined, the tantalum entered the general global supply of a commodity used by essentially every major electronics manufacturer on Earth, which meant that companies at the consumer end of the chain, the phone makers, the console makers, the laptop assemblers, could accurately state that they did not know the specific origin of the metal in their products, because by the time it reached them, that origin had already been engineered out of the paper trail several transactions earlier. This is not a claim that any single named electronics brand deliberately sourced conflict minerals with foreknowledge of their origin. It is a claim, supported by the panel's own findings and by subsequent industry audits, that the trading architecture between the mine and the refinery was built in a way that made such foreknowledge structurally difficult to obtain and, for most participants in the chain, commercially convenient to avoid obtaining. The financial scale of the extraction, once you place hard figures beside it, explains why the war persisted for years after its stated objectives had already been achieved. The panel's 2002 report estimated that Rwanda's military, over a period of roughly 3 years, had derived hundreds of millions of dollars in revenue from Congo's resources, at a scale the report suggested was sufficient to have funded a significant portion of the Rwandan army's operational costs, independent of contributions from Rwanda's own national treasury. Uganda's military networks were tied to a comparable, if somewhat smaller, extraction of gold, diamonds, and timber, supplemented by informal taxation of trade routes its forces controlled across the northeastern Congolese border. For military and political actors on both sides of that border, the war in eastern Congo had become, in financial terms, largely self-funding and substantially profitable, in a way that few conventional military occupations in modern history have managed to be. An army that pays for the bulk of its own field operations out of the territory it occupies possesses a structural incentive that a purely defensive security force does not, which is simply to remain in place for as long as the territory keeps producing. The admission, when it eventually came, arrived in stages rather than as a single confession from any one party. The United Nations panel's reports themselves constitute one form of admission, an official international body naming named individuals and named companies in a document placed into the UN's own public record, even as the states named in it largely rejected or minimized the findings in public statements. Rwanda's government called the 2002 report's methodology flawed and its conclusions politically motivated, and lobbied intensively for the removal of specific individuals' names from the final published version, a request the panel resisted, though a subsequent addendum did soften language around a small number of the original allegations after further review. Uganda took a different path, launching its own judicial commission of inquiry, known as the Porter Commission, in direct response to the allegations. That commission, in its own findings released in 2002, confirmed that senior Ugandan military officers had indeed profited personally from the exploitation of Congo's resources during the occupation, even as it stopped short of formally implicating the Ugandan government as an institution rather than individual officers acting outside their orders. That a government-convened commission, operating under obvious domestic political constraints and reporting to the very state whose forces it was investigating, still confirmed the core financial allegations against its own senior officers, is itself a form of admission that carries particular evidentiary weight, because it originated from inside the system under scrutiny rather than from an external body that the accused states could dismiss as biased. The corporate side of the ledger produced its own quieter and less legally binding admissions. Several of the companies named in the 2001 and 2002 reports were subsequently removed from a later United Nations list of implicated businesses, after providing information the panel judged satisfactory regarding changes to their supply chain sourcing practices going forward. An outcome that functions as a tacit acknowledgement that the practices under scrutiny had in fact occurred, even where no company issued a formal public confession of wrongdoing. Metalor, for its part, stated publicly that it had ceased sourcing coltan through Central African intermediary networks following the publication of the panel's reports. The pattern across nearly every named company was strikingly consistent across the record. No admission of wrongdoing at the time the trade was taking place, followed some years later by a quiet, largely unpublicized adjustment of sourcing practice, undertaken only once the trade in question had become a documented reputational and legal liability rather than an unexamined commercial convenience. The consequence that connects this ledger directly to the present day runs through the device many people watching this video are holding in their hand right now. The scandal around conflict minerals in the Congo became prominent enough in international policy circles that the United States Congress, in the Dodd-Frank Wall Street Reform and Consumer Protection Act of 2010, included a specific and, at the time, unusual provision, Section 1502, requiring every publicly traded company in America to disclose whether tin, tantalum, tungsten, or gold contained in its products originated from the Democratic Republic of Congo or from any of its 9 adjoining countries, and to report on the due diligence measures it had taken to determine that origin. It was, in effect, an admission written directly into American securities law, a formal acknowledgement by the country whose electronics companies consumed by far the largest share of the world's tantalum output that the mineral supply chain out of Central Africa carried a well-documented history of financing armed conflict. Compliance with the provision has been imperfect and contested in the years since its passage, and researchers working in the region have continued to document smuggling routes that move minerals around the formal certification schemes established in its wake, laundering conflict-sourced ore through neighboring jurisdictions with cleaner paperwork before it ever reaches a certified buyer. But the law itself stands as a rare and concrete instance of a war economy's underlying financial architecture being written directly into the regulatory record of the country most responsible, through consumer demand, for having created that economy in the first place. The war in Eastern Congo, in its most intense and internationalized phase, formally ended with peace agreements signed in 2002 and 2003, and most of the foreign national armies withdrew from Congolese territory in the years that followed. But the extraction networks the war had built and refined over those years did not disappear along with the armies that established them. Armed groups, some of them direct successor organizations to the original occupying forces and their local proxy militias, continued to control individual mining sites across North and South Kivu for years afterward, taxing local artisanal miners at the pithead and selling ore into trading networks that, despite the certification schemes introduced in the wake of the Dodd-Frank provision and similar regional traceability initiatives, United Nations monitoring groups and independent researchers have continued to document as porous, underfunded, and in places corrupted by the same officials nominally responsible for enforcing them. The mine changes hands. The uniform on the man collecting the tax at the pithead changes. The ore keeps moving down the same roads, through the same border towns, into the hands of the same class of international buyer that has, across 3 decades of documented reporting, consistently asked fewer questions than the origin of the material would justify. The human cost of that extraction economy was never abstract, and it is worth stating plainly, rather than leaving it implied by the financial figures alone. The mining sites the panel and subsequent researchers documented were, in the overwhelming majority of cases, artisanal operations rather than industrial ones, meaning ore was dug by hand using shovels, picks, and plastic basins, often by men, women, and children working in shafts, with no structural support and no safety equipment of any kind. International labor organizations and later corporate audits estimated that tens of thousands of children were working in and around Kivu's mining sites during the peak years of the conflict economy, a workforce whose wages were set not by any labor market, but by whichever armed group happened to control the pit that week. Sexual violence, displacement, and forced labor were documented by United Nations human rights investigators as recurring features of life in and around the mining areas under militia control, not as isolated incidents, but as a systemic feature of how those armed groups maintained control over both the workforce and the surrounding civilian population. None of this violence shows up on a bill of lading or a customs form. It is the part of the ledger that never gets itemized, because it was never meant to be counted, only extracted from. The peace agreements of 2002 and 2003 did not end the underlying economic logic that had made the war profitable for those who controlled its mineral geography, and the years since have shown that logic reasserting itself whenever political conditions allow. A rebellion known as the March 23rd Movement, or M23, emerged in the eastern Congo in 2012, and a subsequent United Nations group of experts report the direct institutional descendant of the original panel that had investigated the war 2 decades earlier, documented Rwandan state support for the group, along with continued control of mineral trading routes in the territory M23 occupied. The same movement resurfaced with greater territorial gains beginning in 2021 and again in 2024, seizing towns including Goma and Bukavu, the same trading hubs named in the original 2001 and 2002 reports, and the pattern researchers documented was, in its broad outlines, familiar. Control of territory translated quickly into control of mineral revenue, and mineral revenue in turn funded the continued control of territory, a closed loop that has proven considerably more durable than any single peace agreement negotiated to end it. The specific ore in highest demand has shifted somewhat over the decades, from coltan at the height of the early 2000s electronics boom toward a broader basket that now includes significant tin, tungsten, and gold revenue, and more recently growing attention to Congo's vast cobalt reserves, essential for the batteries in electric vehicles and the same smartphones coltan once powered. But the underlying architecture, an armed group taxing extraction at the pithead, or moving through regional trading hubs with clean paperwork attached somewhere along the route, and a final buyer several transactions removed from any practical ability to trace origin, has remained remarkably stable across 3 decades and 2 very different waves of conflict. What the ledger shows, when it is placed beside the standard political account of the Congo Wars, is not a replacement for the ethnic and historical dimensions of the conflict, which were real, which mattered enormously, and which explain with reasonable clarity why the war began in 1996. It is in addition to that history, the part that explains why the war did not end when its original stated cause had already been resolved. Genocide brought Rwanda's army across the border in 1996, and that origin remains true regardless of what followed. But coltan, gold, and tin kept foreign armies fighting, and at times fighting each other, inside Congo for years after the refugee camps that had justified their arrival had already been dismantled, because by then the war had found a considerably more durable reason to continue than the one that had started it. That is what the financial record shows, in export statistics, in named commissions, in a securities law passed a continent away. The political explanation of the Congo Wars was never false. It was simply incomplete, and the missing piece, the piece the standard account rarely follows all the way to the refinery gate, was the ledger. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you loved this story, check out the other videos on your screen now. I think you'll really enjoy them. And don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. See you in the next story.